and thanks for watching this Life Solved short. I'm Robin Montague, and in these videos we get to meet the University of Portsmouth researchers sharing their work in the latest series of the Life Solved podcast. This is work that's changing our world for the better in all sorts of ways. This time we're continuing our look at plastic pollution with Professor Steve Fletcher and Antaya March from the university's Global Plastics Policy Centre, who've just returned from the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee meeting in Paris, or more easily known as INC-2. The gathering was the second round of talks between UN states, 169 to be exact, looking to agree on a global treaty to end plastic pollution worldwide. So have the talks been successful, and what is the roadmap from here? Steve and Antaya, thank you very much for joining me. You're both part of an initiative called Revolution Plastics at the University of Portsmouth. Can one of you just explain what that is? Because it's a concept that I suppose not many people are familiar with at the moment.
Revolution Plastics is the university's mission-driven research initiative to tackle the negative effects of plastic pollution across the entire life cycle of plastics. And we bring together researchers from across the entire range of academic and research areas of the university, from fashion through environmental science, through policy and business, psychology, all the way through to using enzymes to digest plastic waste. Plastics is a really strong research theme within the university.
Now, if anyone listened to last week's episode of Life Solved, you would have heard a bit more about the Enzymes Breaking Down Plastics project, particularly with fashion. And this sort of initiative, is it quite unique in the area of plastic policy and pollution?
Yeah, it is. A lot of universities do research into aspects of plastic pollution or plastic materials, quite commonly as well. But there are very few universities around that really pull all of that together into one coherent research initiative. So I think we're pretty unique in that sense.
And Antaya, what is the Global Plastics Policy Centre that we mentioned in the introduction, and what role does that have with international negotiations?
So the Global Plastics Policy Centre sits within the Revolution Plastics Initiative, and our role is as an independent knowledge broker to provide evidence and support at the interface of governments, businesses, civil society and researchers. And what we're doing in terms of the Global Plastics Treaty is we're providing plastics policy-based analyses that can inform delegates who are there to negotiate the substance of the treaty with what is working on the ground, what are the barriers to effective plastics policy, and how can we improve what we're doing to ensure that what's done at the national level can filter up towards an effective plastics treaty.
And we'll move on to exactly what the Global Plastics Treaty is in a moment. But I just want to touch again on the centre, because something like this, how important is it to have, people like yourselves who are researchers who are doing the analysis, linking up with governments and civil servants, etc.? Why is that relationship or that bridge important?
So what we found, and the reason that we set up the Global Plastics Policy Centre, is there's this critical evidence and knowledge gap that exists about plastics in general, but more specifically plastics policy and what's working on the ground. So there's this huge disconnect between what we're seeing and the policies that are being implemented and the outcomes that these policies are having. And often the monitoring and evaluation associated with policies isn't done by those who design and implement the policies. So there's this critical disconnect between policymakers and on-the-ground change. And that is a key role that we are here to fulfill, is providing the evidence on what works so that decision makers know what routes to take based on how things have worked in the past.
And are there any success stories so far from the centre's achievements over the past couple of years? Is there anything in particular that stands out?
So the work that we've done has been really globally recognized by policymakers, researchers and industry alike, and we have ongoing engagement with various partners in this space. Specifically, we're supporting the UK government through DEFRA in providing continued policy reviews and analyses to support their position and decision-making process for the Global Plastics Treaty, but as well as their national approach to waste management.
Fantastic. And you mentioned there again the Global Plastics Treaty, which is what we're really here to find out and unpack. So what is this treaty and why is it significant?
The plastic pollution problem is pervasive and it has been increasingly problematic over the years, and the global demand for change has increased significantly. And countries around the world have decided to come together, and at the last United Nations Environmental Assembly, they agreed to adopt a resolution to develop a legally binding instrument to end plastic pollution, which we refer to as the Global Plastics Treaty. And this means that all the signatories of the United Nations have agreed to develop a text over the next 2 years, which will indicate all the actions that need to be taken at the global level, including the targets, the ambition, what are the specific policies and actions that need to be taken, and how this is going to be delivered. We don't know yet on what timeline, but it will have something specific that countries will have to work towards.
And you'd think that, plastic pollution is not a new issue. It has been circulating and been at the forefront of people's minds for some years now. Why is it only now, or even in the past couple of years, that governments and countries from around the world have decided to come together and actually address the issue?
It would be unfair to say that governments haven't been working on this for the last 10 years. I mean, certainly the UN Environment Assembly, which is the world's highest environmental decision-making body, has been passing resolutions about plastic pollution since 2014, but they've largely been about trying to understand the problem and trying to figure out what the flows and pathways are of plastics through the world, through the environment, but also beginning to think about the impacts of plastics on human health. But now that work has come to the point where action has to be taken, and there's a real recognition that we have to take action now because the problem is getting out of control and it's just urgent. And so I think the logical next step from where the world was at was to begin to negotiate a treaty, and that's what's happening.
And the first round of talks, INC-1, happened back in November. And can you just give us a rough idea of what they achieved during those talks?
Right, so the first round of negotiations, which took place in Uruguay, really were more on procedural matters. So what is going to happen over the next 5 international negotiating committees? And what this saw was not really discussions on the content of the treaty, but how it's going to work. So key things that they touched on were who's going to be in charge of managing this. So who will be the chair of the INC meetings, and what is that support system going to look like? And then there's more procedural matters around what will the voting system look like? Will this be a concessional treaty, or will it be done based on democratic vote? Looking at things like the scope and the structure, but not really getting into what the nitty-gritty of the treaty will look like. And while these may sound as quite relatively dull procedural matters, these are really important in influencing the outcomes of the treaty and what it will look like based on how influential individual countries can be in progressing the outcomes of the treaty or hindering its progress.
And I suppose for someone that's not involved in the negotiations or just follows what they see in the news or, on the actual UN website and stuff, you do think, why has this not been settled yet? Why have we not signed something and just finished it? We've had months at this. But like you said, it logistically, it's a huge undertaking. Rome wasn't built in a day. And, we need to make sure that whatever we do agree to or whatever is signed has been done right so that there's no issues moving forward.
Absolutely. And another key area that is often neglected is the role of stakeholders in this process. So while all the independent country delegates are there to negotiate the treaty, they're representing entire countries. And there are also a large number of other stakeholders that arrive at these negotiations to make sure that their voices are heard. And this includes stakeholders from industry, stakeholders from community organizations, from environmental groups, from waste picker alliances, and coordinating all of that information is also critically important to ensuring that this treaty is fair and equitable and allows for those who are involved in more marginalized communities to ensure that their rights are protected as well.
So what were you hoping to see then from this second wave of discussions?
So things that we were hoping would become clearer at INC-2 were firstly, how will the effective engagement of stakeholders be ensured as a critical point? Whether or not the treaty will be based on national action plans or global and binding targets or a mixture of both. And national action plans meaning where countries submit individual plans as to what they're going to do to achieve the goals of the treaty. And we can touch on that later. We were also wanting to know what the suggested elements of the treaty will be from UNEP, so what they suggest as the organizational body running the treaty or organizing the treaty, what they think should be in the treaty based on what countries and stakeholders were saying. And then lastly, whether or not these rules of procedure would be agreed upon, what would the rules on voting be, and what this will mean for the outcomes of the treaty.
And you also published a policy brief that was quite critical to national action plans.
National action plans can essentially become a voluntary measure where a country will identify in a plan, or let's call it a roadmap or strategy, as to what they will do to deliver on something such as the plastic pollution problem. Where we've seen national action plans being used in other international environmental agreements is such as the Paris Climate Agreement, where every country submits their nationally determined contributions to indicate these are the actions we're going to take to ensure that we are mitigating and adapting to climate change. So it's very likely that this approach will be used in the Global Plastics Treaty because it allows for national contexts and the circumstances of individual countries to be accounted for, because not every country is the same. Not every country is going to be able to deliver things in the same way. So national action plans are good because they allow for this flexibility. However, what we've seen in the past is that they're often uncoordinated, they're unmonitored, they're non-binding. So this really makes it quite inconsistent and difficult to measure. And it essentially allows for countries to have a voluntary measure because there's no mandate as to what needs to be in the national action plan. So you could produce a national action plan, put it on the table and say, this is the best national action plan that's ever been produced. And that's where it ends. And there's no accountability to really ensure that these national action plans are being delivered. And in combination, what we're seeing is a lack of transparency, a lack of funding to help lower income countries deliver their national action plans or even write them in the first place in a way that is useful and meaningful in their country context, and no legislative support thereafter.
I suppose it's the issue that we face as well with things like greenwashing, where it comes across as looking like countries are doing something to tackle the issue, but without that level of accountability, transparency, or someone actually sat there looking at what they're doing and properly analysing it, it can lead to an inequality in what they're contributing.
Absolutely. And the issue with plastic is it's totally transboundary. It crosses borders. It knows, and the plastic value chain is global. It's not something that's housed within one location. So to have uncoordinated and inconsistent national action plans to deal with a global issue essentially isn't going to work.
And Steve, then that brings us on to how did things actually play out then in INC-2?
We started to see some of the geopolitics come into play, I think it's fair to say. After the first couple of days, though, the discussions moved on, thankfully, from procedural matters and really focused on the substantive matters that were in the options report that UNEP published ahead of the meeting. And this is really important because the discussion of the substantive matters helps the INC Secretariat to understand where countries' views are around some of the key issues. So, as we've talked about already, national action plans are one of those key dividing lines between countries, with, in broad terms, the more ambitious countries keen on legally binding national action plans and less ambitious countries keen on more voluntary, less monitored national action plans. So in order to move the discussions forward, then the countries need to understand where each other lies in terms of the spectrum of opinion around all of these key issues. But I'm really pleased to say that by the end of the negotiations on Friday evening, they ended with a request submitted to the chair of the committee meeting to develop a zero draft of the treaty ahead of the meeting in November. And what that means is that by the time the next meeting happens in November, there will be a full draft of the treaty that the negotiators will be able to begin discussing. But it was only with that discussion of the substantive issues for the last 3 days of the meeting in Paris that request to the chair could be made. Otherwise, the chair would have no clue where countries' opinions were vis-a-vis the critical issues of how they wanted to deal with pollution.
It's quite hard to sort of speculate at this time, so this isn't a speculation question. It's more of a what would be your ambition to see in that treaty?
Well, I think from my perspective, and Tay, you might feel differently about this, but what I certainly would like to see is a real focus on tackling plastic pollution at source. It's increasingly obvious that no waste management system anywhere in the world really can cope with the absolute flood of plastic that's being created, used, and becoming waste. The world's just drowning in plastic. So what I think should happen is that we need to reduce the amount of plastic entering the economy in the first place. And there are ways of doing that. We could have a ban on certain types of plastic. We could have a tax on plastic that makes plastic less attractive. And we could transition to the large-scale reuse systems, where instead of having single-use plastic, we have reusable materials, which means we don't need to create the single-use plastic in the first place. And that's the sort of plastic that ends up being pollution, that tends to end up being pollution. So I'd definitely like to see a reduction of plastic entering the economy. Next, I'd like to see some way of circulating plastics in the economy as much as possible, so that plastic that does exist is useful and continues to be used. And at the end of its life, it has value. It can either be reused or recycled or refilled in some way, so it doesn't get lost out of the system just to become incinerated or to be put in landfill or to become pollution, which of course is what happens at the moment. And the final thing I'd like to see is some way of dealing with plastic that properly is at the end of its life, or plastic that was made before the treaty came in place, and there's just no sensible end of life way of reusing it or refilling it or anything like that, or even recycling it. So we just need to find a safe way of dealing with that plastic.
So Steve's really covered the content of the treaty, and I think some critical things that we're going to need to see in terms of how the treaty is going to work is particularly we're going to need legally binding stringent measures that encourage countries or almost force countries to take action, because there are a lot of countries with vested interests in the plastics economy that will naturally be resistant to this type of change. What we're also going to need to see is financial support and technical support for countries with lower capacity to help them be able to deliver on the targets or requirements of the treaty. And very importantly, what we'd really like to see in the treaty is that the informal waste sector, the waste pickers, are really included in the treaty and aren't forced to formalize in a way that removes their rights and ambitions for their lives. So making sure that the treaty is really equitable and accounts for all the different communities involved in plastics and waste management.
Because this isn't just about an environmental impact, it's the economy as well. And like you said there are some countries that have a stronger investment, but also it's people's livelihoods. So all those little things, people tend to forget when it comes to something that's so, widespread as plastic pollution. It's a huge undertaking.
As well as being an environmental and an economic challenge, plastic pollution is also increasingly recognised as a human health problem as well. There's all sorts of studies coming out now all the time that are demonstrating plastic is reaching all parts of our bodies now, but as yet the research isn't quite there to determine conclusively what the effects of plastic's presence in our body is. However, I think most people recognise that we need to be precautionary about this and really put measures in place to safeguard human health in the treaty. And in fact, in some of the discussions around the treaty, people are referring to it not as an environmental treaty, but a human health treaty with environmental and economic and social dimensions as well. So it's really shifting the narrative around what we think the main problems associated with plastic pollution are, away from the effects on largely the marine environment to effects on people's lives, people's well-beings, people's health. That's critically important stuff.
Definitely. And then moving forward then, the next round of talks, when are they taking place and what are you hoping to see from them?
So the next INC is going to take place in Kenya in November, where countries will reconvene to discuss substantive issues. So now that they've agreed on rules of procedure, we're going to be moving more into the content of the treaty. So as we mentioned, the chair will have had to draft a zero draft text of what the treaty could look like, and that will provide the basis for the discussions where countries will then provide their inputs as to what they think of the draft text, and it will be changed from there. So hopefully by the end of INC-3, we'd have a revised draft text around which the next negotiations will take place.
Looking into the future, when will we have this treaty signed? What's the sort of timeline that we're expecting?
So they set a very ambitious timeline for the delivery of the text of the treaty, which was 2 years. So we're hoping that by the end of 2024, they should have the final treaty ready. Now, this is a very tight timeline for an international negotiation, but that really highlights that the global ambition exists and the urgency is there to deliver this treaty. However, that doesn't mean that at the end of 2024, countries will all be bound to what is in the treaty. Then there's still the process of signing and ratification of the treaty. And what the head of the United Nations Environment Programme really emphasized at this INC is that industry and countries should really not delay action and wait for this treaty to be in place to start moving forward in addressing plastic and plastic pollution, and really should start working now to make the changes needed to address something as urgent as this.
And while we have breaks in between these talks, it is important to note that things are still happening behind the scenes. Work is ongoing. Your team are constantly doing new things, looking at new innovations, exploring new research, and reflecting on things that have happened already. In Portsmouth, for instance, in June, there's going to be the PlasticsFuture 2023 conference. So can you just give our listeners an idea of what that conference involves? It's quite exciting for us.
Yeah, it's quite exciting for us as well. We've got probably around about 120, 130 people joining us in Portsmouth for a really exciting interdisciplinary conference. It's a 3-day conference exploring different aspects of how we can tackle the plastics crisis. And we're coming at it from all sorts of different angles, from a sort of psychology angle, from fashion. We're talking about the way in which microplastics have a role to play in all of this. We're also talking about the global plastics policy, the Global Plastics Treaty, of course, and also looking at plastics as a feature of society and how that's changed over time, and really adopting a natural science, social science, and arts-based approach to how we consider tackling plastic pollution. And it's really great, actually. It really reflects the way that our team works, because we do come from a whole variety of different disciplines. But it also reflects, I think, how important it is not to just see plastic pollution as a natural science question. You know, how do we change the chemistry of the polymer? Or how do we stop certain impacts on species? But seeing this as an embedded social, cultural challenge that requires all sorts of economic, social, cultural shifts, as well as understanding the science better. And I think there are not many universities and certainly not many conferences that really adopt that sort of approach. So we're really excited about it and looking forward to it.
Thank you both so much for talking with me today on Life Solved. It's been a really interesting discussion on plastic policy. These negotiations, both at a national and international level, are growing, and it's fantastic to see that we're making a really positive step forward, and hopefully we'll continue to do that. If you'd like to listen to our full episode of Life Solved Unpacking INC-2, head to the University of Portsmouth website or download it on your favourite podcast app now. You can also click the link in the comments box below or head to port.ac.uk/research to find out more about the university's Global Plastics Policy Centre. We'll be back for a new series in August, so stay tuned and we'll see you then.